addition to the legislature, they mentioned
Okay.
but it seems to be mending is more similar.
Welcome everyone. We're Today is May the 9th, 2021. We're here in Craftsbury Village at the corner of Cemetery Road and South Craftsbury Road, right next to the Craftsbury General Store, for the first presentation of the Craftsbury Historical Society for 2021. And my name.
I don't think the mic is on. I'm hearing it, but maybe it's okay.
Test. Okay. Got to get closer. Okay. All right. We'll try it again. Okay.
Thank you.
So I want to just thank Don Houghton for making arrangements so that we could do this, and the weather gods for giving us a break of sunshine and a little bit warmer temperatures today, and you all for coming out. My name is Jim Flint. My wife Barbara and I purchased our home here in Craftsbury just about 9 years ago, and we've really enjoyed our chapter of life here. And history is kind of a neat thing, because so much of the time we're focused on either the present or the immediate future in our lives. And every once in a while the veil parts and we get this little glimpse back into the past. And what I'd love for you to do today is to be able to set yourself back in the past. We're going to go back more than 100 years to start with, and to let that veil kind of part and get a glimpse into Craftsbury as it was many years ago. I grew up in Hebron, New York, which is a farming community just across the Vermont border, and as a kid I was fascinated with treasure hunting. That was my big thing. And we lived, 10 miles away from school, 3 miles from the nearest town, and I was at the tail end of the line in our family, and I like to hunt. So hunt for things, artifacts, that sort of thing. So I got into bottle collecting when I was in middle school. I dug up the extensive dump that was on our property from years in the past, down about 6 or 7 feet. And then when I got tired of digging, I decided to go explore in abandoned houses on back roads and hill farms, and down into very scary looking basements in search of bottles, which I often found and then brought home and cleaned them up. I was really fascinated by old cellar holes, and just thinking about the lives of the people who lived in these hill farms and what it was like for them. So every once in a while I get that bug again, and I got it perhaps because of COVID, but this spring in March I started wondering more about this home. When we first moved here, Dave Rowell was the real estate agent who was selling the home, and Barb and I kind of stumbled upon it. And one of the things I remember him saying is that this was the last house built in Craftsbury Village, perhaps, or even in Craftsbury, between 1930 and 1960. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. Well, I've later discovered that's not exactly true, but the sentiment is true, because Craftsbury went through a period of condensing. It peaked, I think, probably in the Roaring '20s, and through the Great Depression, and then the World War II and beyond, there was a somewhat of a decline of populations, back on the rebound again. But that was something that stuck in my mind. When we moved here, the Betts sisters, who are right here, Geraldine and Audrey Betts, had lived in this home since 1984. Geraldine died in 2009, and Audrey died in February of 2012. We purchased the home in June of 2012. They had no heirs. There were two sisters who were joined at the hip and simply loved this home. They were the longest residents of this house. They left behind a few things, like a mink coat, I guess that Dave didn't find a home for, but everything else was auctioned off to benefit a local animal shelter. But there was also very little history for us to go by. We couldn't really talk to them, although we still do talk to them sometimes. They're the friendly ghosts that inhabit the house. And every year there's a couple of lilies right by the doorstep that I noticed have sprouted again this year that come up that we call Audrey and Geraldine, because they're just a reminder that they're here. We asked the lawyer, Angela Ross, who handled the estate, if we could have something of theirs. And she gave us this picture, which goes with the house and stays with the house. And since we knew they were clearing everything out when Barb and I were here for a second visit, there happened to be her obituary on the refrigerator, and we did, I have to confess, we knew that would probably go in the trash, so we do have that here as well too. Geraldine was a World War II nurse, and they both were just quiet people who lived out their lives here, as others did who have inhabited this house. Oral history is a really treasure when you can find it. And Bob Twiss, who was the war hero, World War II veteran who lived here and grew up in Craftsbury, he was alive when we came. And one of the things that he told us, he was part of our church up on the Common, was that there was a tennis court in the backyard when he was growing up. So I want you to think about that a little bit. Where you are all sitting, if you look at the dimensions here, it's roughly 40 feet by about 80 feet in this area where we are, this rectangle, and it's pretty flat. So a tennis court is 36 by 78, so could very well fit within this. And Bob wouldn't have lied, so he remembered that from his boyhood. So I tucked that away too, under my hat, and didn't really think about it for another 8 or 9 years until this spring. Roberta Hodgson, who lives during the summers with her husband Gary in the double wide in the lot across the road, actually grew up in this house. She is the only teenager that we know of ever to live in this home. And she came here with her family in the mid-1960s and graduated from Craftsbury Academy. And then when she was in college, her parents sold the home. And her dad moved across the street and then over to the mobile home, and Gary and Roberta have continued that in as part of their family. So Roberta told us a little bit about what it was like to grow up in this house. Bob Brown lives in the house that you can just see the roof of over the hillside. His wife Rachel passed away last year, and Bob grew up in the village, and he shared with us that when he was growing up, he played with electric train set up in the attic with someone who lived here. Now, there weren't any kids that we knew of who lived here, but Lula Johnson had grandkids. Donald Johnson lived in Ann's home across the street, and his that would have been Lula's son, and his children would have possibly, or someone was here during that time period, and Bob has a vague recollection of that. So I tucked that away too. And then we went on about our lives. And last spring, when I was cleaning the back of the garage, because it was COVID, and after 8 years, I finally cleaned the garage. And I looked up in the back corner of the rafters, and I saw this tan sack. I took the step ladder, I went up, hauled it down, and lo and behold, I found this pack, Boy Scout pack. And I wondered, how did that get there? So I did a little research on that, and found that it belonged to a man named Don Lean, who some of you remember here. And he in Craftsbury. But how it got into the house, I'm not sure. but I think probably it got up into the rafters when Henry Young, who built the garage in 1975, found it in the attic and tucked it away for safekeeping up in the corner of the rafters. So another little mystery. And as we began to think about selling our home this spring, that window where the past is unveiled got narrower and narrower. I said, I've got to jump through that window and see what more I can find. So I started digging around a little bit and went to the library, and there's a book in the Craftsbury Library called, from 1984, which is an inventory of historic houses in Craftsbury. And it has detail about many of the houses here in the village and up on the Common in East Craftsbury. And the description in that of this house is that this 20th century classic cottage was built about 1930 by a man named Taylor. And Harry McIntyre had bought a large 2.5-story house on this site from Ella Simpson Howard. And when it burned, he sold the lot to Taylor. And then it talks a little bit about the house. So I had that piece of information. And I also noticed from the Craftsbury Historical Society's Facebook page the photos of the fire back in where are they? I think they're right there, Anna, if you want to grab those. Of the fire, which supposedly was in 1930, at least according to a book in the library about the history of the general store. And these were, quite interesting to look at closely, because I could picture looking at the store from this angle, about where we are in this picture, but I couldn't quite figure out where this one was from. And when I looked at this particular picture here of the side of the store, it looked like it was taken from our front lawn, and there was a whole lot of rubble there. So I kind of wondered about what was going on with these pictures and how our house related to that. Whoops. Might be a little bit of a challenge. So you can pass those around maybe. So my curiosity was certainly piqued here, and I knew that Doug McClure down at the Hardwick Gazette often writes about historical events in Hardwick, and goes back and cites references from past issues of the Hardwick Gazette. So I thought, oh, Doug must go over to the Historical Society and thumb through all those issues and find the references that he's looking for. So I thought, well, Doug, is there any reference to the Craftsbury fire that I think took place around 1930? Not more than 5 minutes later, Doug emailed back and said, yeah, here's the story on it, which is, this is the one from the Free Press, but there's another similar in the Hardwick Gazette. And I said, how did you find that so fast? And he said, it's really not a secret. They're all available digitized online, and I just searched for it, and boom, it popped right up. So he pointed me to a website called newspapers.com, which some of you may be familiar with. What is interesting about that site is that you can get a 7-day free trial, and I had done that before, but then the 7 days expires, and it's like, I don't need to pay, X dollars a year for this. I've got my research done. But Doug said there is a free way to look at all of the Vermont newspapers through the Vermont government website, and it's available to any Vermonter for free. You can research any of the Vermont newspapers. So he pointed me to that website. I got on, and then I started to get addicted, because you could find out anything about anyone who was connected to Craftsbury or anywhere else, and the clues just kept coming together. One of the things I found out was that the fire was not in 1930, as was cited in the book in the library, as was cited in the bicentennial guide that's at the Historical Society. That was passed down through oral tradition, but the fire was actually on July 12, 1931. And the article was very detailed in the Gazette and also in the Burlington Free Press, talking about what happened here. And in my mind, I was still thinking that, oh, this house was built in 1930. It must have been here during the fire. And then the light bulb went on, and I realized, no, that wasn't here. There was another 10-room summer inn that was here on this site that burned to the ground. So I called up Dave Link, and I said, Dave, you know, I'm finding this information. Do you know anything about this? And he told me about George T. Howard, who originally built that summer inn, and George H. Howard, his son, who lived here and grew up in Craftsbury. And I began to start to piece this genealogy of the house together. Dave also showed me an insurance map, which is down here, Miguel. You can just grab that. Because I was curious as to, you know, where was that in? You know, where exactly? I got it. Yes, good position here. So, Cemetery Road is here. Main Street, which they called South Craftsbury Road at that time. Here's the inn, general store, and then what's really interesting is that down here was a farm, a barn and a home, and that barn, through the map, I could figure out was 2-story probably. Judging that there may have been a high-rise here out to the barn, and that the fire, which started down over the bank here in the barn, with hay that was probably put in wet, burned the house over on that was attached to it, and then that spread up to this barn, and then spread to the barn attached to the summer inn, then to the summer inn, and then over to the store. And it was all, you know, kind of piecing it together from the map, from the historical account that was in the newspaper article. So that you know, that piece gave some details, and now it was time to dive in a little bit deeper. So I went over to the town hall with my the deed to our house, which is here. And you know, if you deeds get stuck away in, you know, fire safes, and we don't often look at them, but they tell a story, at least a part of a story, and they tell who came before, going back usually 3 or 4 house sales before. And each of those deeds is recorded in a bound volume over at Town Hall, in a book with a number on it. So what you can do is you can, if you have your deed, or even if you don't, there's an index at Town Hall, you can go back and find your deed in the book in Town Hall, and then that will tie into a previous deed. So I started just going back, and when I got back to 1931, the name Lee B. Taylor showed up. And Lee B. Taylor was the son of the general store owners, Fred and Winnie Taylor. And that this was his first house. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the details of the story about how it became his first house. But I kept on going back from there, all the way back to 1895, when George T. Howard purchased the 5-acre parcel here, which probably would have extended out in that direction, from John Urey, the owner of the general store. So that's the, you know, kind of the fascinating part. Those deeds are all very detailed, but if you trace them back, any piece of property, you just keep going back in the records. You start out in one cabinet, and then when you get to the really old books, they're on the other side of Town Hall in the other cabinet. So that information became part of trying to piece together the historical record. That gave me names and it gave me some context. And now it was time to go back to the oral history side. So I hopped on the internet and I just Googled Lee B. Taylor to see if anything would pop up. And Lee B. Taylor popped up over in Burlington. And I thought, how common would it be for Lee B. Taylor for those two names to be exactly the same? So I did a little more hunting on newspapers.com and I found the obituary of Lee B. Taylor, the first owner of the house, and it talked about a son, Lee B. Taylor. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is it. So I emailed him. He was a realtor over in the Champlain Valley. And that evening he emailed back and said, yes, my father did live in Craftsbury, but I didn't know what house he lived in. So so that was a really aha moment. And what was fascinating was that this was his father's second marriage. So Lee B. Taylor is only 3 years older than I am, and his father was the first owner of this house 90 years ago. So he was born when his dad was 50, and his dad died when he was 50, when he was only 8 years old. So he never really knew his dad that well. But his older sister was about 12 years older. He put me in touch with her, and she remembered her grandmother, who was the co-owner of the store here. So they sent me some family pictures, and we started a communication, which resulted in a couple of weeks ago, Lee B. Taylor, his sister Jane Taylor Vincent, and their other sister, Marcia Taylor Smith, coming here to visit Craftsbury, to meet Emily at the general store, and to have a tour of the house that their father had built. So this was just a fascinating way to not necessarily get a first-person account, because they knew their dad, but they didn't know anything about this chapter of his life. They did send me some pictures, which were really kind of neat too. It's just interesting to think about. But here is Lee B. Taylor back in probably the late around the time of World War I. Here's maybe a high school picture, and they also, I'll kind of pass this around so you can see. Challenges of an outdoor presentation here. And they also sent me this picture, which they thought was taken here in Craftsbury, of Lee and his dog. What was... Oh, there's my rock. So, this is Lee and his dog, probably taken right out here somewhere on the edge of the driveway. At that time, there were not as many trees in Craftsbury as there are now. But what was interesting that they told me about is that their grandmother had destroyed all of the photographs of this chapter of Lee's life. And I'll share with you a little bit why that may have happened. So this was perhaps the only remaining picture of their dad from his time in Craftsbury, which spanned about almost 15 years here in Craftsbury that he was here. So this is part of the journey of discovery. And now what I'd like to do is share a bit more about the story of what happened. So I'm going to take it back to 1925. 1925 was a momentous year in Craftsbury Village. There was a young teacher at the village school. Her name was Miss Rose Smith. And she moved, teachers of that time didn't make a lot of money. And when they were single, when they were about $1,100 a year in 1930 or 31, they were single and they boarded with people around town or in a boarding house. And Miss Rose Smith was a beloved teacher here in Craftsbury. She taught here for 30 years and then was the postmistress for another 15. But in 1925, she moved in with the Mackenders, who had just bought the Summer Inn, which was a 2.5-story, 10-room inn from George H. Howard and his mother, Ella Simpson Howard. So Rose was living here in the inn, and across the street was a man named Fred Kemp. And he lived in where Herb Harris lives, right in this carriage house, former carriage house, I think, for the inn, right across the street. Now, Fred ran the town garage. He was a bit younger than Rose, I think 7 or 8 years younger than Rose. But they apparently became quite good friends because in August they got married. And she moved from the Mackenders' boarding house over across the street. She was, among other things, she was the organist at the elementary, at the Methodist Church, which was where the elementary school is now. And in October of 1925, she went up to practice the organ before church, and the furnace had caught fire down in the basement. And she sounded the alarm, but it was too late to save that wood frame church, which at one time seated 400 people. So that burned to the ground, but was quickly rebuilt as what you now see as the elementary school. So that was 1925. The Mackenders had just bought their summer inn. Rose was one of the first residents there as a boarder. But the Mackenders came from Hardwick, Harry and Lilla Mackender. And Harry ran a meat business. He had a meat cart. Also had a slaughterhouse of some kind as well, too. And they were beloved people here in Craftsbury. They ran the summer inn, and that inn they named the Homestead. And it was quite famous for its chicken dinners. So after they got going for a bit, they became a wayside inn, which was like the AAA of that time, a certified inn. And I'm going to read you just a little piece of their of the inn's reputation in Craftsbury. Here we go. Sunday chicken dinners served at the Homestead. During the summer, it is well to plan Sunday chicken dinner at any place but home. And we'll go on here, as it keeps mother in the house and working hard in order to feed the family. So it's possible to take dinner out most reasonably, and it does give mother a good change. All right, keep in mind this is the 1920s. The Homestead at Craftsbury, and this is Mother's Day, so appropriate. The Homestead at Craftsbury, Vermont serves special Sunday chicken dinners, and the food is good. Dairy products from the Homestead's dairy, garden, truck from the Homestead garden, and strictly fresh eggs from the Homestead hennery make the standard of the table very high. Craftsbury, Vermont is only 7 miles from Caspian Lake and is on the main road from Montpelier to Montreal. That was probably before 14 was built out there. Here is a delightful little town indeed, and for the person who must have a most reasonable vacation, yet have good food and surroundings, the Homestead at Craftsbury is the ideal place. Right here in the inn. So the Mackenders were very involved here in the village, very beloved people. And on the morning of July 12th, 1931, folks were just getting out of church, there where the elementary school is now, and the new church that they had built, Methodist Church. And of course, they were no strangers to the impact of fire. And they looked down from up on the hill. There were not the trees that there are now. It was probably pretty wide open. They looked right down here and they saw smoke coming from Clyde Gilbert's barn, just right down here. And that barn stretched probably over about to the driveway from the insurance maps. So they knew what was happening. It was July and the wind was blowing, and they sounded the alarm, but Craftsbury at that time only had a pump, gasoline-powered pump, that would support 2 1-inch fire hoses. So they rushed down, they got the pump going from the sawmill ponds, and the wind was whipping, that hay caught fire, the barn, which was much bigger than the house, attached to it, family of Clyde Gilbert and his wife and 3 young children, they got out with their lives. And the fire was raging in the barn. Hay burns very hot. And up here on this site, there was a barn attached to the inn. Now the inn, I believe, stretched out about where that maple tree is. So it was closer to the general store, and the barn would have come back in this direction. Probably close to where our garden is there, and strawberry patch and so forth. Not too far from where we're sitting. And the wind blew that fire and caught the homestead's barn on fire, which was attached to the house. Now it was Sunday morning, so the Mackenders were getting ready to serve their guests. And one newspaper accountant said that they were expecting 35 guests, and another accountant said that there were 12 guests already there, getting ready for Sunday chicken dinner. And you can imagine the ovens are going, this is the old-fashioned, ovens and the, preparations and all of that, getting ready for dinner, and all of a sudden there's a fire. Well, the guests helped them get some of the furnishings out of the house. But that fire moved very quickly. By 1 o'clock, things were just out of hand, and they sent out a call for mutual aid to Hardwick, Morrisville, Newport, Orleans, and Barton. And the newspaper accounts of that day say that that was the largest convergence of motorized, modern fire equipment ever in the Northeast Kingdom up to that point. There were some 2,000 people here witnessing that fire. And the Hardwick volunteers got here in 11 minutes from Hardwick.
Wow.
Which was quite speedy. The mutual aid call went out at 1. As soon as they got here, they trained their hoses on the 3rd floor of the general store, which was in danger, because the fire hopped from the homestead just across the way there to the west side of the building, went right on up to that 3rd floor and caught it on fire. When the mutual aid companies got here, they trained their fire hoses on, and through the volunteer efforts and so forth, they were able to save the store except for the 3rd floor. So you can imagine this was a pretty big shock for the village. You're losing a house, a barn, a summer inn, and the 3rd floor of the general store, not to mention the fact that the post office was also housed in the general store. And they rushed down, the postmistress and her husband rushed down, saved the supplies from the post office, which relocated over to the town hall temporarily. After the owners, Fred and Winnie Taylor, got over their shock of that destruction, they didn't waste much time in trying to figure out what to do next. So all of the properties were insured, and the store was insured for $25,000, which in 1931 was a tremendous sum of money. Fred and Winnie Taylor and their son Lee were pretty resourceful people. They had run a general store in the past before up in North Troy. They'd been in the community for 5 and 6 years. They had a groundswell of support. They decided not to rebuild the 3rd floor. They salvaged the apartments up there. They had a huge fire sale, which had the following week, which had about 2,000 people come here to Craftsbury that went well into the night with 22 clerks. Now, Lee Taylor, their son, was 25 years old. And any of you have sons who been in their 20s? Anybody out there? Yeah, a few. Okay. So Lee was an adventurer, and this was the Roaring 20s. Lee had gone to Craftsbury, or gone to Hardwick Academy. He was 6'5" tall, and he was gregarious. He'd grown up in a store in North Troy, with his parents as the storekeepers, and he liked a bit of adventure. So his parents, I guess, did too, because as soon as they became empty nesters and he graduated from high school, they moved from Hardwick to Craftsbury and bought the building, which was renamed the Taylor Building. So Lee had various adventures during his post-high school years. He decided to travel across the country with a buddy, got as far as Akron, Ohio, came back to Craftsbury. He had a car, and he was pretty popular around town. He was behind the cash register at the store, and there were a lot of young people in town, a lot of young adults at that time period. Marjorie Britton came here in summer of 1930. She was a teacher at the academy, first-year teacher, and she was from southern New Hampshire, and she was a kind of adventurous as well too. Her middle name was Lind. She was named after a Swedish opera singer, Jenny Lind, who toured with P.T. Barnum. So it was a distant relative of hers. So she's up here as well too as a first-year teacher. Lee had been, kind of here in Craftsbury. And of course, the young men of that time, if a first-year female teacher was here, that was of interest, would have been of interest. So she went home for the summer in 1931 in June. He went down to visit her. And a couple weeks later, she was back up here in Craftsbury, and then the fire happened. And she pitched in. She was hired at the general store to help out. And I guess, the two of them continued their relationship, because on July 20th, just 8 days after the fire, they walked across the street to the town hall and filled out a marriage license. And then on August 2nd, they went over to his uncle in Jeffersonville, who was a reverend, and he married them. Now this was, I think, probably unbeknownst to their friends and the rest of the community, maybe even to his parents. On Monday morning, they were back at work at the general store. And, meantime here, this is in the aftermath of the fire. So on August the 2nd, they were married. On August the 8th, Fred Taylor bought this lot from the Mackenders. Everything was destroyed. He bought the lot and the 8-acre parcel that went with it, and separated out this lot. So by the end of August, there were plans to build a house. And by January of 1932, the new couple was happily living and settled in a brand new house. Built with local lumber, certainly from the sawmill down the creek, and with all the goodwill that this young couple would have engendered at that time. So they suddenly, now I can't quite figure out why the parents didn't build a house for themselves and have their son and daughter-in-law maybe up in the apartments of the store. I can't quite figure that out, but Lee was a good salesperson. So perhaps, he sold his parents on that idea. And they seemed to be pretty happy here during the 1930s, at least according to the newspaper accounts in the Hardwick Gazette. Every community had its social column, and the Facebook of its day, and you can literally trace the happenings of what happened with their lives. But this was the Great Depression, and times certainly got tougher as the 1930s progressed. In 1939, they moved from Craftsbury to Bradford, presumably to be closer to her parents. In 1941, they were divorced in May 1941. So something happened in there, and by 1944, Lee was remarried and brought his new bride up here to meet the parents. And then in 1945, the parents sold the store. So from 1925 to 1945, this was the Taylor and Son store, and then the Fred Taylor store, and the Taylor building. And that experience that they had was really, a product of the history of the times, going from the times of the 20s, Prohibition, to the 30s, where Craftsbury was still a pretty vibrant place in the early 30s, to, I'm sure, the tough times of the later 30s and the onset of even of World War II. This house has had several owners since that time period. It went through a period of many years where the folks who lived here were connected to Craftsbury, right up until really until the Betts sisters bought the house in 1984. So its social history came about in a very unique way, but then it settled into the fabric of the community. So I'm going to take just a little time check. Okay, we're in good shape. I wanted to pause and just find out what you might be wondering about, from that story, or about this house itself. We are going to have a chance to take a peek inside the house from the front entrance, which we never used, but I thought today's a good day to use that. So you can see the original woodwork that was built. That was part of the house in the living room. But are there questions that you might have? Yes, Amelia.
I was curious. I did know the Betts sisters, not well, but knew who they were. They were around at a lot of different events and such early on, I think. I was wondering what brought them here. They have connections.
The
Craftsbury Inn, my understanding.
That's correct. The Betts sisters stayed here at the Craftsbury Inn.
Repeat the question.
Yes. The question was, how did the Betts sisters get here? They were from New Jersey. Grew up there. They vacationed here in Vermont and found their way to Craftsbury in the Northeast Kingdom. My guess is that they were across the street when Barbara Wenke was the owner here. She was the owner for about 10 years. She moved here with her husband, Martin, and I don't have a picture of them, but Martin's tie holder here, monogram tie holder, was left in our closet. I just discovered this a couple of weeks ago when I looked really closely and said, okay, now I know who Martin is. But they lived, the Wenkes lived at Faraway Farm, which is the Fox Farm out on Mill Village Road. And it was a second marriage for both of them. Barbara was quite a bit younger than Martin. And when they moved here in 1975, they moved in the fall of 75, and Martin died in April of 76. So Barbara was here on her own. And my guess is that the Betts sisters knew that the house had become available. Barbara died in 1983. There was a period of time where it was in a state, and they just heard about it. They were right across the street, and they bought the house for $60,000 in January of 1984, and then happily, they were the happiest people according to folks who knew them here. They loved decorating the rooms, changing in and out the furnishings, and they had an old car that they kept for years and years and years, and only drove to Morrisville with it. But they lived out their lives here very happily. Yeah.
You cleared up a mystery for me.
Sure.
So my grandmother, who grew up across Route 14 at the Jim Jones farm, was part of the first generation of French Canadians who came to live here in Craftsbury, and they were not always treated well by all of the locals because they were the immigrant population. She always said that when they moved to Walden, her brothers would come home from school with shirts torn and lunch boxes bashed in, they came here to Craftsbury, she always spoke of the kindness of the Wells family.
Steve and Abby.
Steve and Abby Wells, who were up at the end of what is now Wells Road. But she also said that Rose Kemp, her teacher, would not allow that kind of treatment to any of the new French Canadian kids. So she really held the line for civilized and reasonable behavior. And she had said to me that Rose had lived at the inn. In my mind, the inn was that building, and it didn't make sense to me because I knew at that time it hadn't been an inn, at least I didn't think it was. So it was this inn that she was probably speaking of.
The newspaper article about Rose Kemp, or the clipping that I found, said that she moved from the Brewster House, which I don't know where that was.
Right.
Oh. Right next to the farm stand.
It's across from the green space, right? It was, right.
Ah.
That was a boarding house, too.
Yep, it said the Brewster boarding house. So she moved from the Brewster boarding house to the Mackenders in spring of 1925, and then was married in August.
And my grandmother would have been about 8 years old then, 8 to 9 years old. So that would make sense that she was of school age and aware of this teacher who was actually not allowing her siblings to be mistreated in school. And they were at the school just up the hill, the two-room schoolhouse.
Yeah, and Rose Kemp lived to be 99 years old. She was older than her husband Fred, but she outlived him by several years, and she's buried down in the Craftsbury Village Cemetery, as well as the Betts sisters are there too. So that middle period between the time when Lee and Marjorie divorced and the house was sold until the Wells family, Roberta's parents, bought it. Those years, Lula Johnson was here for 20 of those years, and Lula is Corinne Johnson's great grandmother, who is here. Her children were Donald and Robert. Robert was Corinne's grandfather, and her grandchildren would have been your dad, your dad Rick Johnson. So she was beloved as well too, famous for her cookie making skills, and she came from a farm out on Route 14 with her husband. So that brought a sort of a farm presence, back here. Perhaps the tennis court disappeared when Lula was here, and maybe some of the gardens started.
What were the years again that Lula was here?
Lula was here from 1943 to 1963. A woman named Arlene Daniels bought the house from Lee Taylor. And Arlene was a colleague of Miss Jean Simpson's. She was a librarian in East Craftsbury for years and years and years, some 30 years. And she only had the house for about a year, and was fairly young. She was in her 30s when she bought the house. Her brother, Clifford Daniels, took the fire photos that were going around, so he was a photographer. And there, Daniels Road up towards East Craftsbury is where their family homestead was.
Big gray house.
The big gray house, right. And other questions that I have? Yes?
So it's not a question, just the observation, and it's obvious as can be, but it's striking how central fires have been in this place. Our house, we're told, and we've seen pictures. Our house burned to the ground, and it's been rebuilt. It's more recently than this one, but the same story. But to know that's why the general store has this sort of strange top out on it.
That's right.
Pete's barn burned when we moved to Vermont. That happened, and it was shocking, and it changed everything in a lot of ways. It's just amazing.
Apparently, there are still charred timbers up in the crawl space there's a little bit of third floor still up on the top of the general store. You can't see it from here, but the roof slopes back in this direction. And Emily has told me that she found some charred newspapers and timbers in the crawl space up there. So, and imagine another story on the general store, how big that was. Imagine a 2.5-story section of this inn on this side, and the inn would have been closer to the road, the front porch of it. So, and it was dirt road, of course, at that time. So this was a very condensed. This village was extremely condensed from the agricultural era with the horses and the need for so many barns and hay. Dave.
On a separate note, in doing some research with the old diaries, we discovered that this building burned in December 14th, 1883.
Wow.
The
store.
same building.
Yeah?
Oh.
Huh.
Like to the ground, burned to the
You want to repeat
That
that?
I don't know, but they lost, the post office was there, they lost so many thousands worth of foodstuffs and whatever like that, but how much structural problems they had, I don't know the details. It's been hit lightning strikes at least.
Right.
Fires.
So Dave mentioned that the general store had burned at an earlier time period as well in 1883. So fire definitely a very important part of shaping this whole community as well. Amelia.
So you're saying this is the summer house, or summer
Summer inn.
where they did the breakfast.
The summer inn was here that burned to the ground.
But there's also has also been the inn forever?
Yes, I didn't research the history of the Craftsbury Inn. It's 1850 on the side, but that was not always an inn. It was an inn at different time periods. And interestingly enough, and you include us into this, Amelia, Dean and Anka Brown purchased this house from the Wells, from Judge Wells, Roberta's Hodgson's parents, in 1974. And Dean and Anka had come here because of the inn. They ran the inn for 3 years, and I guess this house became available, and they bought it. And we're pretty sure, based on the time period, as I was trying to figure out who owned the house when the garage was done, the breezeway, and when this dormer was put on the second floor. See, originally it was just a one-story cape, and then that dormer was put on. All that work was done by Henry Young. And I learned from his son, Kent, as Bob had told me that Henry had built the garage, so I called up Kent, left a message. Kent works for the town, and when he was going by with the grader one morning, he stopped and said, "You're the person who called me?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I'm Kent." So he said, "Oh." So he told me that he was a teenager, and his dad worked at Lemoore Union High School in the technical building trades program. So in the summertime, they built the garage, the breezeway, and the second floor. And he was just out of high school, so he remembered it was 1975 because he graduated in 1975. It was that summer, and I did find up in the top of the breezeway a big long screwdriver that one of the guys must have left behind. So I'm trying to return that to Kent because it must have been his dad's. But that really reshaped the house, and that would have been during the time period when Dean and Anka owned the house. And when I think about it, they were into real estate. That Dean was one of the original founders of the Craftsbury Outdoor Center. He and Arnold Smith, who lived down the street where the green space is now in the house there, they plotted that out at their kitchen table while he lived here in this house. And then they moved up the hill to where the Serraldis live.
They built that.
and built that house, and Ted was their architect, and then eventually he bought the house from them. So that was a fairly short period of time, but they they changed the whole dynamics of the back side of the house. The front still looks the same. Kevin.
On the town floor, there's a picture of the downtown village here. You got it, great.
I've got it right here.
Can you point out the buildings?
Sure. The general, I'll pass this around, but the part that struck me on this is the general store is here with the third story. And I was trying to figure out what year this would have been. So their electricity came to Craftsbury Village in 1916, at least according to the Hardwick Gazette. There are no electric wires. So I'm thinking this is before 1916. Cars came to Vermont practically in the 1920s with Henry Ford's Model T. That was the beginning of the automobile age. And strangely enough, there were more cars in rural areas than in urban areas in Vermont in the early years because the urban areas had trolleys and buses and things like that. So what was interesting to me is that I could see just a little glimpse here of a building on our lot. All of the other pictures of Craftsbury are taken from like our front yard. So you never see this house. I'm still trying to find a picture of the inn somewhere. Maybe up in the East Craftsbury Library there's something, but there's a little glimpse of what was here. And another picture has another glimpse of the buildings around. But going back to the 1800s, there were barns on the side of the store. It was just that you needed a lot of buildings to be able to keep that agricultural part going with all the horses and the feed and all of that. Obviously, some of these buildings have disappeared, but the Masonic Hall, I believe, is still here, and the house next to the garage is still there.
Which one's the Masonic?
That.
Right where the Boy Scout battle
Guild.
was.
Yeah, it may be this building right here on this end. It's a
Boy
little
Scouts were
hard to
collecting
tell.
back then, right?
Yeah.
I thought you said
So-
the window.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the
So
Masonic.
there was a big building next
Yeah.
to it. Was this a home? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, that's where the garage is now,
Right.
and that has gone out, as well as the barber shop, which many of you remember, is not here anymore either. So, Craftsbury Village was the hub, of the business community here, and founded, I think, in 1818 with the beginning of the sawmills. But by the turn of the century, this was a happening place. And this, those fires definitely had an impact. Other questions? Well, we're going to take a little walk around so that you can see, peek inside the front door of the house. I'll say from here, well, you can all hear me. The millwork that you'll see, the trim work inside our living room. There's a fireplace there. There are two French doors to the left that go into what was Roberta's bedroom, but would have been a little den area when it was built. All the woodwork around the trim is still in its original condition, and even the lock on the front door that you'll see is original. One of them is an original lock. I googled the manufacturing company for it, and that millwork. Sharon Reed, who grew up here in Craftsbury, she told me that her great-grandfather worked on this house. Was one of the carpenters who helped install the millwork on this house, and it wasn't wood that came from locally. It came from the Farley and Letcher company out in Dubuque, Iowa, which shipped by rail all over the country the trim work and cabinets and so forth that went into the arts and crafts houses of the first part of the 20th century, right up into the 1930s. So, being store owners, they would have access to a catalog called the Universal Millwork Catalog. And they would have, you can, when I Googled that online, I downloaded a copy of it. And the exact French doors, the exact front door is in that catalog that they would have ordered from. So it's like, wow, that's where it came from. And the kind of cool thing is that it's been so well preserved. But given the people who were here and who took care of the house, it's really kind of understandable. So
I just want to.
yeah.
Do you have a question?
Well, I heard that you sold the house now to Emily.
The house is under contract right now to Emily's fiance, Evan.
So it's kind of going back to store owners.
Well, that's the kind of history is repeating itself, and perhaps a young family, will be back in the house. There's other than Roberta, there haven't been any children who've have been raised here. So we'll see what they decide to do. So yeah. So, but we'll be here until the middle of June anyway. So at least I'll be here. Barb's down in West Rutland. West Rutland.
Well, I want to thank Jim, but of course the other thing, the one last thing that's implied here is he just gave us a roadmap, for anybody who wants to study the origins and the history of their own property. So, that's a pretty valuable lesson as well. So thank you, Jim.
I made a few copies of the fire article from the Burlington Free Press. So, maybe one a household or something like that. So
I can take one.
those around. So yeah.